The night the roof finally learned my name, it leaned so low I could smell the rot in its breath, and as the dog with the torn ear pressed his shoulder into my knee, the way a partner does when he is done asking and ready to insist, I understood that there would be no miracle from the highway, no mother appearing with a clean coat and change for the payphone, only the kind of choice that makes a boy older than his bones. Build now or let winter make its own decision about my future. I kept the tin box under my sleeping mat like a secret I could touch when the dark turned loud, and inside that box, the last thin emblem of faith, a soft-edged 20 that had been unfolded and refolded so many times it felt like cloth instead of paper, the crease as deep as a ravine and just as unforgiving. I used to hold it up to the light as if the watermark could answer questions about whether a goodbye can still be honest if it is wrapped in a promise. But out here, among the ancient pines where the mist moves like an animal with its own slow mind, I learned that paper keeps no one warm and that some prayers are only instructions to move your feet. The cabin waited in the clearing with the patience of something that has been hurt and is willing to be useful anyway. Windows gaping like hungry mouths and a porch that bowed as though it had been kneeling too long. I walked its perimeter, counting sins I might forgive. Shingles splintered, chimney stones missing, sill plates black with time. And even as I told myself I was only taking inventory, I felt heat gather in my chest the way fire gathers under a stubborn stack of damp kindling. Not joy exactly, but a forward tilt in my blood that said this ruin could be argued into shelter if I learned to speak the grammar of wood and nail. Scout, thin as a line drawn in pencil, but already sure of me in a way I had not yet learned to be sure of myself, kept glancing from the sagging rafters to my hands. And I understood he was measuring whether I would keep faith with the sandwich we had shared behind the dumpsters on that first night when the air tasted like fryer grease and fear. So I closed my fingers around the rusted hammer I had found in the shed and felt how its weight turned my wrist from child to apprentice. And I said out loud, to him and to the boards that still remembered the names of other winters, that if no one was coming back, then this place and this dog and this boy would have to make a country of 3. The first strike rang dull against a bent nail, and the second found truer metal, and with every sound, the woods around us changed temperature, as though the trees approved of noise that meant survival rather than surrender. I ripped out the worst of the rot near the hearth, dragged a broken table carcass into the yard, swept mouse nests into a bucket that had a hole and therefore a purpose, then coaxed a narrow flame up the throat of a reluctant chimney until smoke found a direction that wasn't my lungs. And when I knelt to warm my hands, I realized that for the first time in too many months, the heat came from something I had made, and not merely from something I had stolen from an afternoon sun that wasn't mine to claim. Night arrived with a steady drum of cold rain, like a teacher tapping a ruler, and the roof answered with a tired groan that told the truth about weight and time. So I set pots under the worst drips and told myself that a man can sleep through music if he names the notes. But the water multiplied, the pinging became a chorus, and when the new leak opened directly above my bedding and the lamp hissed its last breath, I felt the tightness rise in my throat the way a bad memory chooses its moment, and I said, I can't, into Scout's damp fur, because sometimes the only thing that keeps a boy from breaking is the confession that he is close. He stood there with more patience than people and waited while the storm used its vocabulary. And when the rafters finally surrendered with a sound like a snapped promise, and a sheet of filthy water and debris slammed into the spot where my head would have been if sleep had found me, I understood with that cold clarity you only get when you almost die, that despair is a liar with good timing. I dragged what could be saved into the corner where the floor still remembered how to be dry, pushed water out the door with a board that used to be a shelf, wrung my blanket until my hands burned, then sat in the gray afterlight and took an inventory that had nothing to do with objects. 1 dog, still here. 1 hammer, still heavy. 1 boy, still breathing. When the rain softened and the clouds thinned to wet wool, Scout gave a bark that wasn't warning but invitation and trotted toward the laurel like he had found a sentence I needed to finish. I followed him through a tight corridor of green and slid down into a narrow ravine where leaves had been falling into the same small gravity for longer than I had been alive. And there, half buried, patient as a buried heart, weighted the bed of an old pickup with a red toolbox sleeping under a skin of rust. I said, "Good boy," with a voice that had already grown older, levered the box free, fought the latch until it surrendered with a pop that felt like luck agreeing to work for wages. And when I opened that small steel room and saw the handsaw with teeth like small promises, the screwdrivers that could argue with stubbornness, the pliers that could teach wire to remember, and the nails wrapped in oilcloth as if someone before me had known a child might need them, the storm that had tried to make a tomb of our bed became, in a single breath, the reason I would build instead of wait. And as I hauled the toolbox toward the clearing with Scout dancing on legs suddenly full of weatherless joy, the mist lifted off the cabin just enough to show me the line between ruin and work, and I understood that night had tested my answer and that morning expected me to keep it. By the time I drew the first crooked map on the back of a tourist brochure no one wanted, I had already traded the last tattered thread of waiting for a grammar of motion and quiet, because the mountain does not bargain with boys who promise to be patient while roofs sag and mothers forget which road returns to the child they left by a magazine rack. I began with the hearth because every house that hopes to be more than walls must learn where its heart sits. And I cleared the corner by dragging out furniture that had decided to be mushrooms instead of chairs, swept a decade of mouse arithmetic into the yard, and laid twigs with the care of someone setting bones, then fed a match to the small architecture I'd built and spoke softly to a draft that wanted to turn the room into a chimney. The smoke pushed back hard, then changed its mind and went where it should, and the first honest warmth I'd felt since the day a cashier said, "Honey, is she coming back soon?" rose from stone into my hands as if the cabin itself were willing to forgive me for arriving with nothing but a dog and a memory. The map came next, because the part of me that had once believed in timetables and pickup times needed a new religion, and so I sketched the spring that never tasted a medal, circled the waterfall that rinsed fear out of my hair, crossed the thorn thickets that tore stories out of thin clothing, starred the rabbit warren scout located with a nose that did not understand the word tomorrow, and shaded the places where the land itself felt wrong, not dangerous exactly, but uninterested in helping the living. Each mark I added loosened another knot I had tied to a clock that no longer ticked for me. And as the paper turned from advertisement to atlas, I felt my spine take on the same slow, sensible curve as the creek that kept us from being foolish about thirst. The lies I told to pass unnoticed, my dad up ahead with the tackle box, my mom in the truck with a headache, my uncle at the far pump paying for gas, had once been small ropes I used to cross rooms full of adults without getting pulled into back offices. But out here they lost their shine and fell from my mouth because the only person I needed to convince now was the boy who slept on boards and woke to creaks that might be mice or might be the cabin remembering how to speak. On a night when the wind worried the eaves and the lamp drew a thin halo on the wall, I lay with Scout's breath warm against my ribs and said the sentence that shook loose the last of the waiting. "She's not coming back." And though my throat burned the way a cold morning burns bare skin, the words themselves did not kill me. They cleared space, the way a good axe swing will open a path through and in that space I could hear, for the first time, the sound of a life that did not require permission. Days collected into a rhythm that felt almost like belonging. Mornings at the stream where I argued with length of fishing line and a straightened hook until trout flickered into my hands like quicksilver confessions. Afternoons of patch and pry and measure, where I learned the stubborn sweetness of wood that will yield if you listen before you command. Evenings on the step, with Scout's shoulder steady against my shin, while the sky lost its color and the forest found its voice. And in those hours, between last light and first fear, I could feel the cabin's bones forgive my hands for being so new. Storms kept their own calendar and gave no heed to my progress, rolling through in white-veined tantrums that split pines open like overripe fruit and taught me that steadiness beats courage if your aim is to see another season. When lightning punched the ridge beyond the clearing and thunder made the floorboards thrum like a drum against my spine, I spoke to Scout with a calm I borrowed from somewhere older than my face, told him that a house which creaks is a house announcing its strength, that every groan is a promise not to break yet, and I believed myself long enough to keep the match dry, to keep the fire smoldering under damp wood until the air lost its teeth. Between tempests we began the patient science of water and flame, lashing gutters from salvaged tin and wet rope so rain would remember to fall into the dented pot we promoted to cistern, smoking meat over a greenwood curl so a rabbit could feed us for 3 days, and not just one, hanging bunches of something bitter that an old book called medicine and that I called hope, because chewing it made my headache kneel. In the ledger carved into my mind, I stopped counting days since the gas station and began counting how many boards no longer flexed under my heel, how many leaks had been taught manners with clay and cloth, how many nights I slept without waking to check if the dog was still breathing. It is a strange mercy when numbers begin to feel like promises you can keep. When the first frost drew ferns on the glass and the geese wrote their long note across the sky, I felt the mountain purse its lips and prepare to test whether my hunger for this life was theater or oath, and I stood in the doorway with Scout vibrating beside me and told the valley in a voice that didn't shake that we would meet winter with something better than luck. Yet beneath that bravado, another truth moved, slower and deeper. The map I had drawn to survive was slowly drawing me back, not to the highway or the gas station or any face in the old world, but to something with its own gravity. A boy who had chosen, a dog who had agreed, a house that could learn to breathe again if we kept teaching it to do so. And as I tucked the map into the tin box next to the softened bill, not an altar now, just a relic that reminded me why I had left, I felt the wind shift along the rafters and heard the roof answer in a tone that was almost approval. And for the first time since the word wait had become a sentence instead of a verb, I slept without bargaining. When the roof finally surrendered, it did not merely give way to rain and gravity, it caved in with the authority of a verdict. And as the filthy sheet of water and rotten planks slammed into the dent where my head had been a breath earlier, I understood with a clarity that felt like ice inside my ribs that the boy who kept waiting by magazine racks had died sometime between the first drip and the last groan, leaving behind someone who would either build a life tonight or be buried by the weather before morning learned my name. The collapse began as a series of hints that I pretended were inconveniences, a ping here and a sag there, a tired complaint from the rafters, a softening of the boards above the bedroll where I kept the tin box, and the shame of my soft-edged 20. And I moved pots into patrol positions like generals mapping a doomed front while telling Scout with a calm I borrowed from somewhere beyond my years that a leaking house can still be a loyal house if you listen to the messages it sends. Yet water multiplies with a genius I had never respected, finding paths in seams and nail holes, turning the floor to a shallow pond. And when the lamp coughed its last light and the room became a wet throat, I felt despair arrive like an unwelcome relative, specific and heavy and convinced of its rights. And I said the words I had not let myself say in months, the words that tasted like surrender in 12-year-old breath. I can't, I can't, I can't. And for a moment, the admission warmed me the way fever warms, because finally I had stopped performing competence for the benefit of no one. Scout did what the best companions do when bravery turns thin and noise becomes judgment. He stepped into my shivering and leaned his torn ear against my cheek until the small animal, panicking in my chest, recognized a larger animal keeping watch. And in that borrowed steadiness, I lifted my head and saw the truth I had missed. The beam that had come down like a hammer aimed at my skull and missed because the storm stole sleep before it stole structure, which meant that something in the dark loved me enough to nudge me awake, whether that something was a dog or a house or the stubborn part of me that would not be extinguished. I crawled to the dry corner where the floor still remembered how to be wood and not lake, pushed the heaviest of the fallen timbers aside with noises I will never repeat if I can help it, dragged what remained of our bedding out from under the insult. And then I did the first small thing that turns a disaster into a sequence. I opened the door and gave the water a place to go that was not my lungs. The sun arrived behind the storm like a late judge, with a generous docket, sending a weak light through the open wound in the roof that showed me exactly how much the night had taken, and I stood in the cabin's middle, soaked to my bones and somehow taller, and I counted the salvageable, not by price or beauty, but by future usefulness. The pot promoted to basin, the plank promoted to squeegee, the blanket promoted to rope, once it was too wet to warm. And with each promotion, my breathing slowed until it matched the tempo of the small rivulets escaping down the steps, each finding its own life away from mine. When the room had become less lake and more battlefield after the first truce, I sat on the threshold with Scout's shoulder pressed against my shin, and I made a list out loud. Not because the dog needed a plan, but because I did. Branches straight enough to lash into ribs, a cover that would respect water better than rotten boards, a way to keep the next rain from turning our bed into a basin. And as I spoke the list, the softness that had filled me with I can't drained away and left something harder, stubborn, and unpretty, and willing to sweat. I had barely stood to fetch the first armful of pine boughs when Scout delivered a single bark so clean and particular that every hair on my arms stood up, not alarm, not greeting, but invitation. Come and see, come and take, come and change your odds. And I followed him through the mountain laurel that clawed at my sleeves as if to test whether I meant my determination, slid on damp leaves into a narrow ravine where spring runoff had carved a sentence into stone, and there, half buried beneath a decade of autumns, waited the rust ghost of a pickup's bed with a red toolbox nested in decay like an egg that had decided to hatch exactly on the morning I grew tired of drowning. I spoke gratitude out loud to whatever saint or scavenger had left it, because gratitude, like tinder, lights better if you keep it dry, then clawed the box free, pried at a latch that argued its case with all the stubbornness of the mountain. And when it popped, I became a different animal, because inside was not charity, but agency. A hammer with a scarred face that remembered impact, screwdrivers whose tips could persuade old screws to tell the truth, pliers with teeth made for teaching wire about obedience, a handsaw with small shining triangles along its edge that looked like patience sharpened, and a bundle of nails wrapped in oilcloth that someone wiser than me had protected for a future they could not predict. I carried the weight up the ravine with Scout dancing, and by the time we broke back into the clearing, I had already designed 3 temporary roofs and 2 better ones, and a way to maybe, possibly, earn sleep again. Temporary fixes done right become declarations, so I lashed ribs from straight branches and spoke to the frame while I worked. I know you're tired. I know you held more winters than I held birthdays, but hold with me for 1 more hour, 1 more test, 1 more rain. And I draped the tarp I found under the truck's seat across the frame with such careful attention to pitch and runoff that engineering might have forgiven me for never learning its language. Then I stitched tarp to branch with fishing, line until my fingers bled, weighted the edges with stones that felt like yes in the palm, and by the time the next small squall came nosing across the ridge like a hound looking for a reason to bay, the drips that made it through were so few and so well behaved that I could place cups under them like polite guests and go back to my other labor, which was believing that I could keep this promise tomorrow as well. By nightfall, the cabin smelled of wet wood and tired victory. The fire coughed, remembered itself, and then settled into that steady conversation that tells you your work has been accepted. And I sat with my back against the hearth and let the sleep that had been stolen return by inches. Not because I had defeated the mountain, but because I had become teachable in its arts. And when the rain returned in a lighter key, the roof answered with a new voice. Not strong yet, but disciplined. Not proof against everything, but proof against enough. At first light, with the tarp still humming its low song and the house breathing closer to my rhythm, Scout stood in the doorway and looked toward the ravine with a question in his spine that sounded like a plan. And I knew today would not be about patching, but about rebuilding, because the saw in the toolbox had slept long enough and the cabin had asked for more than a bandage. I rose, rolled my sleeves, and told the morning that if it wanted a better roof, it should hold still while I learned the teeth of a new tool. The first miracle did not arrive with a hymn or a handshake. It arrived with a metal click as a red toolbox surrendered its latch, and the smell that lifted out, iron, oil, rain that had turned old dust into paste, felt like the mountain's way of conceding that faith without tools is a poem, while faith with a handsaw is a plan. I carried the box to the porch like a courier delivering terms of peace after a siege, set it on the plank table that still pretended to be furniture, and opened its mouth wide enough to see the inventory of my next season. The hammer greeted my palm the way a good dog greets a returning friend. The screwdrivers sorted themselves by the arguments they wanted to make, flat tongues for stubborn slots and cross tongues for modern compromises. The pliers tested the bite of their teeth on a length of wire that had forgotten it could be obedient, and the handsaw spoke the quiet grammar of progress. each tooth a conditional clause that promised results if I supplied patience. The tarp from beneath the truck's seat stank of milk, smelled exactly like. And when I shook it out across the porch, Scout stepped back with a seriousness I had learned, because he understood that this was not about keeping, this was about creating a roof that would accept responsibility. Our sleep. I began by studying the roof line with the same attention I once reserved for the highway when I watched for the car that never returned, tracing the slope with my eyes, learning the way the eaves poured, memorizing where old nails had failed, and why. Because the lesson of the storm had been simple and absolute: ignorance is expensive when paid in warmth. Then I cut ribs from straight saplings with the saw whose teeth sang in a thin, bright register, and I lashed those ribs into a grid that distributed weight the way a strong back takes a heavy load without complaint, and I stitched the tarp across that grid with fishing line in stitches so tight that if shame had been sewn to my chest in the same fashion, it would never have fallen forward to choke my breath again. Where the tarp met the rotten edge of shingle, I slipped inferring strips pried from a wall that had more boards than it required for dignity, and I drove nail after nail through cloth and wood into history until the hammer's rhythm taught the house a new heartbeat, one that kept time with my own. The first tester rain came like an examiner who asks no questions and simply watches what you do when the paper is blank, and I stood beneath my new roof with Scout leaning against my leg and counted drips as they gathered into the polite, predictable places I had invited them to live. A cup here, a pot there, a single thread running down a seam I already knew how to cinch tight with a strip of oiled cloth, which meant that during the storm I could turn to the work beyond reaction, replacing floorboards that had given up on bearing weight, prying up soft planks with the pry bar I found in the truck's bed, and sliding in truer lumber salvaged from a collapsed shelf, planing edges with a patience that surprised me until board met board like two facts that had stopped arguing. With dryness earned rather than begged, the rest of the cabin began to collaborate. The stone hearth accepted a new lintel that fit its shoulders, the door frame straightened enough to let the latch rest in its cradle without violence, and I built a shelf from offcuts and stubbornness that lifted our few possessions up into order, which changed nothing and also changed everything, because possessions that are off the floor feel less like debris and more like a life. I even found the truck's side mirror half buried in leaves and mounted it at eye level, not out of vanity, but as a promise that I would learn the face of the person who was building this place, since one day I might need to recognize him in a different room under a different light. The tools taught me to make decisions that outlast moods, to measure twice when nerves insisted on haste, to prize the humility of square against the seduction of eyeballed good enough, so that when I cut a beam to sister against a wounded joist, I honored the wood by asking what it wanted to do before I told it what it must do. Scout followed me round and round the room as if keeping a boundary against doubt. And when I sank the last nail of the day and sat back to listen, the house responded with a new kind of silence, not the brittle quiet of abandonment, but the dense, forgiving quiet of a room that has been asked to work and has agreed. I did not trust my luck and therefore treated it like a contract, spending the next days in a marathon of patience, trimming tarp edges to shed water, adding a drip edge. From a strip of tin I hammered flat, dabbing resin into old nail holes like a seamstress who refuses to let wind find purchase. And then, because winter had announced itself in a cold updraft along the floorboards, I laid a scatter of straw under a canvas runner to interrupt the draft. A simple trick learned from a page torn out of a book so old it smelled like attic prayer. Each evening, I recorded improvements on the back of the map that had once only shown how to survive, turning error math one number. After a week of this covenant with roof, I allowed myself a different ambition, not just keeping water out, but inviting order, which is how the porch became a workshop, with tools hung where my hands could find them in the how the firewood stack acquired a G that pleased the eye and satisfied the how the dented pot used cloth and sand and charcoal. When I finally led me of fishing a trout after hours of sleep that did not request more pride than tea, and I watched the roof ignore a passing squall, and I said to Scout with the solemnity of a vow that competence and that I intended to love this place with the kind of devotion's pilot hole that checks level, the valley, and while I admired hardens that cast iron sovereign teach fire, I set down an animal deciding not to die. And when heat finally rolled off the cast belly in slow waves that smelled of metal and second chances, I understood that roofs keep rain off the living, but a fire that holds the night is what persuades hope to unpack its bag. I had ignored the stove all summer because the sun did the work for free, but the first frost drew fern-bone patterns on the glass and made my breath a small ghost. And the wind coming through the gaps along the floorboards carried a lesson I pretended not to hear. Summer forgives mistakes that winter will prosecute. The stove squatted in the corner with its door hanging askew like a boxer's lip, its pipe in sections on the floor, the seams powdering under my thumb with rust that turned my skin orange. And I felt a familiar impatience rise, the twitch that says, good enough. But tools have a morality that does not bend. And the handsaw and pliers and screwdrivers I had rescued from the red box watched me like a jury. So I began the careful, shaming work of doing it right. I scraped flakes from the throat of the elbow, pared corrosion from the pipe ends until steel remembered its shape, rubbed rendered fat into tired joints the way you rub balm into cracked knuckles, and wired the door hinges true where their pins had forgotten duty. When I nested the pipe sections together and offered that hungry mouth to the chimney, smoke answered first with insult, and then, after I tapped a stubborn blockage free from the flue, with a steady draft that pulled flame upward like a good story pulls breath from a room. Wood changes its voice when it knows it will be asked to keep someone alive. I fell deadfall with the saw singing in its thin, bright register, trimmed limbs into lengths that fit the stove's appetite, split rounds with a rhythm that became a prayer against panic, then stacked the pieces under the porch in a geometry that promised future heat. The way jars on a pantry shelf promise future sweetness. The stack grew from a sentence to a paragraph to a page, and I measured its height with my forearm, because numbers written in your muscles are harder to miss. Scout supervised with the kind of attention that looks like distraction until you realize he is keeping a boundary against despair. Trotting loops around the clearing, pausing where the came coldest through, returning to nose my move too fast, risked carelessness. And each time he did that, I would force my shoulder and ask the wood to confess its grip. By the second week old, I had learned the stove's moods, as well as any creature. It hated green and sulked if fed too much pine. It preferred split oak to. It asked for small only ash and from ankle to. I learned the wood without starving flame. To tuck smooth river stones along the hearth, to steal heat for after midnight and slip them warm as a living thing into the bedclothes when the hour grew mean. Learned to sweep the stovepipe without waking embers that would argue with my lungs. Nights settled into a pattern you could stake a life to. Add a log at 10 with a wedge beside it like a promise. Close the damper to the sweet spot. Check the lashings on the gutter run. Run a hand along the roof seam I had stitched with fishing line. Mark a tally on the back of the map for boards replaced and leaks silenced. Settle with Scout's ribs breathing against my calf and the small crackle of wood turning memory into ash. Then the sky turned the particular nickel green that means weather is sharpening its teeth, and though the calendar said early winter, the air said audition. And when snow came, it did not drift down like lace, but walked in heavy boots. And by dusk, the path to the stream had glazed into a ribbon that would break an ankle for the price of inattention. The stove lifted its eyelid and seemed to say, without changing expression, "We will see how much of your talk is lumber and how much is paint." The first real snow locked the world to silence that sounded like a hymn. I woke to the roof, humming at a lower pitch, not the old groan of surrender, but a patient note that spoke of weight and responsibility. And when I opened the door, the yard had been erased and redrawn with careful white. The split-rail fence softened to a suggestion. The woodpile transformed into a sleeping animal with a silver back. I moved through chores as if the snow would rescind permission if I hurried. Shoveled the porch with a flat board that did not deserve the title of shovel, but did the work. Brushed the roof edges with a broom lashed to a branch so ice wouldn't teach rot a new trick. Knocked icicles from the gutter mouths before they could lift the tin and undo my stitches. Tamped a small berm of snow against the north wall where the wind bit hardest. Then stood back and checked the seams, as a person checks his own skin for fever, trusting hands more than eyes. By afternoon, my inventory had turned from tools to truths. The woodpile would last in comfort through January, in care through February, in prayer into March, which meant new rounds must be split each clear day, no matter what excuse my bones tried to sell. The pantry could be coaxed toward lean months if the trout were generous and the snares complicated, which meant I must spend thought on protein as well as planks, The kettle must be kept filled not because tea is luxury, but because hot water fixes a problem before it becomes a crisis, and crisis is expensive and cold. I made notes on the back of the map as snow tapped the window in a patient code, tin patches holding, resin plugs behaving, west eve still whispering when the wind leans hard. And with each neat line of pencil, I felt fear rearrange itself from fog into work. The first night of deep snow, I sat beside the stove longer than usual and told Scout stories he already knew. The dumpster grease night and the sandwich torn in half and the way his ribs had disappeared under his winter coat like regret under purpose. And he looked at me with the solemn indulgence dogs offer to children who are working out the arithmetic of love. And in that gaze, I felt the truth settle into place. Competence is affection, spelled with tools. The cabin breathed heat into the seams of my coat, and for the first time since the collapse, I let my knees go slack. Near midnight, with the room warm enough to make the windows sweat, Scout lifted his head and turned his ear toward the tree line with the concentration that means not fox, not owl, not wind. And in the long pause that followed, I heard it too, a distant crunch measured and human, boots cutting a rhythm into the frozen path. I set the kettle on the hottest circle and slid the hunter's knife nearer, by habit rather than need. And when a voice finally called out from the white, "Hello there, mighty cold to be walking," I had already made my decision. We would open the door, because a house that has learned to breathe should learn to speak. He stepped out of the snowfall as if the mountain had decided to show me a future with a beard, his breath haloing around words careful enough to cross ice. And when I let Henry inside and the door swung shut on that enormous quiet, the room recalibrated, as if the stove, the dog, and the boy had been waiting for a witness to say, "Yes, this is real." He wore snowshoes like parentheses around each foot and moved with the deliberation of a man who knows how far a mistake can echo. The frost had braided his beard into a color I had not seen up close in a long time, and he took off his hat with a politeness that did not ring hollow. Scout did the math from the safety of my knee, nose working the air like fingers across a page, and decided this visitor belonged to the class of animals that might improve a room if granted a chair. I pointed him to a peg by the door, asked nothing, and prepared coffee in a dented pot as if I had guests every day. Because hospitality is not about ceremonies. It is about permission, and I found that I had enough to spare. Henry thawed in stages, his voice coming warmer with each sip, first about the storm, then about the ridge he had crossed, then about the 30 winters he had notched into these hills, and finally about the thing I could not stop hearing even when he changed subjects. The way he kept not asking questions that would have sounded easy and wrecked everything. I offered the rabbit we had snared the day before, and he offered chocolate that made Scout blink as if the smell itself were a story. And the room filled with the shared grammar of tin plates and careful knives. We ate without hurry, which is a skill hunger rarely allows until you've taught it patience, and he kept drifting into small compliments that did not embarrass me because they were practical. The sock-drying line rigged above the stove, the way my woodpile faced the prevailing wind, the drip edge along the tarp seam, the split kindling stacked by size near the door so a cold-fingered boy does not have to hunt for fire. Each observation landed like a small stamp on a passport. You may cross, you may proceed, you may belong. When the wind rose and put its shoulder into the north wall, the stove answered with a steadier flame, and Henry shifted his pack with an odd gravity, then placed an object on the table with both hands the way a person might put down a sleeping bird. An old film camera with leather scuffed to honesty and 3 rolls of unshot possibility. And he said, not as a salesman, but as a man giving a tool to a craftsman, "You should document your world. Some things are worth remembering." The camera changed my pulse in a way I didn't expect. Tools fix things, maps direct you, stoves endure you, but a camera is a witness that can be carried, a promise that the shape of this morning might be recalled when the world is noisy again. I held it wrong at first, and he gently corrected me, showed me how to seat the film, wind the lever, meter with my eyes when I had no meter, steady my breath so the shutter would be the loudest part of the moment. And I realized that he was not just showing me how to operate a machine, he was giving me permission to consider this life worthy of being seen. I took a trial shot of Scout dozing with one eye open, of the stove with its door cracked just enough to show the heart, of the new roof seam where my stitches ran confident as a scar that has decided to be handsome, and when the shutter clicked, it sounded like a small gate opening somewhere I could not yet name. We talked until the snow let up. Henry knew these ridges like a man knows a poem he has recited too often to forget, and his advice slid into my notebooks almost without my choosing. How to read a sky that will deliver ice, how to smell the difference between fresh bear and yesterday's bravado, how to lash a sledge that won't tumble on the downhill, how to sell a carving for what it is worth without flinching. He did not pry into missing mothers or gas stations or the arithmetic of abandonment, and his silence on those matters honored me more than curiosity could have. When he finally rose to leave, he patted Scout with 2 slow strokes, adjusted the strap across his chest, and said a sentence that has visits in hard hours. "You're not just surviving, son, you're making." He left tracks that the next squall began to fill, even as I watched, the open door letting in a slice of cold that felt like the price of the lesson, and I closed it with the care you give to a good book. The cabin felt larger after his absence, not because he had taken space with him, but because he had left more room for purpose. I set the camera on the mantel beside the tin box and the small, carved dog that looked a little like Scout and a little like the idea of Scout, and I promised the room that I would use it for more than nostalgia, that I would record the way the wood shines under oil, the way the kettle blooms steam, the way the dog tilts his head when learning a new word, that I would make a ledger of light to balance the ledger of work. That night, I lay awake longer than the stove deserved and let the camera's presence pull memory like a tide. The boy at the magazine rack with a 20 soft-as cloth, the cashier's eyes trying to be kind and efficient at once, the first sandwich halved with a stranger who did not stay a stranger, the drip that became a storm, that became a collapse, that became a roof that decided to keep me, the rhythm of the saw and the arithmetic of the woodpile, the thrill of a plan that required no one's approval. I saw those things as if I were already looking back from a better shore, and in that reverie, I understood a different kind of hunger, not for safety or sleep, but for proof that what we build matters beyond the hour we build it. Before dawn, Scout rose and pressed his nose to the door with urgency that was not fear, and when I opened it to humor him, a knife of cold slipped under my coat and drew my attention to the porch step, where a brown paper parcel sat tucked under the bench, damp but intact, and inside were seed packets labeled in a careful hand: beans, carrots, squash, hope, and a note with 4 words that did not sign a name: Spring remembers the faithful. The day I found the seed packets tucked beneath the porch step, folded neat, inside waxed paper that had kept out a season's worth of doubt, I realized the mountain was not only testing me, it was recruiting me, and that the difference between a shelter and a home is whether you plan food 6 months before you are hungry. I spread the packets across the table the way a doctor lays out instruments, reading the faded labels like a foreign alphabet I intended to own. Carrots with their root quiet patience, beans that climb if you give them a story to ascend, squash with the swagger of big leaves that shade the timid corn that requires a tribe to stand tall, tomatoes that sulk without heat but will reward loyalty with sunlight trapped in skin. The paper held a faint scent of earth even sealed, and I felt the old itch in my hands, the one that reaches for tools when a future is on offer. The ground outside still wore white in the hollows, but the south patch near the fence held the dark shine of thawing soil, and I went out with the shovel and tested the first inch, then the second, then the depth a root might desire, and I could feel last season's leaves crumbling under the blade into the kind of crumb that pretends it has always known seeds. I had read about gardens in books that survived my earlier life. Precise diagrams with straight rows and Latin names and yields you could brag about in calendars. But books rarely smell like work, and the shovel corrected my angle and my arrogance in the same hour. I cleared a rectangle where the sun lingered longest, lifted stones that would remember the heat and offer it back at night, measured with string pilfered from the roof repairs so my rows wouldn't wander like a tired walker, and cut trenches with the side of the hoe until the soil sighed rather than resisted. Scout wandered the perimeter with the solemnity of a watchman and flopped down where the light pooled in a trick under the eaves, his eyes half closed but his ears sorting every noise. The first time I pressed a seed into that black mix of patience and rot, the world went quiet in a way I had only heard at 2 other moments. When my mother's car pulled away without a backward glance, and when the stove caught clean, and the quiet said the same thing both times, decide who you will be next. I planted not as a farmer would, but as a boy who has learned his own arithmetic. Every carrot a promise to a future self who might be too tired to hunt, every bean a ladder out of a smaller worry, every squash hill a vote for shade when July bites, every corner of the plot a proof that I believed in something I could not see. I tucked the seeds at the depth the packet suggested, and then listened to the soil the way you listen to a friend choosing a hard truth, adjusting here, deepening there, pressing just enough to confer contact without denying air, then watered with care I usually reserve for fire, not drowning, not teasing, but a measured pour from a tin that had spent its first life as a gas can and now carried a different fuel. I rigged a crude fence from branches and salvaged wire to keep rabbits from teaching me humility I could not afford, added scare string that flickered when the wind remembered its tricks. And then I did the thing gardens demand that does not come naturally to hunger. I waited without complaining. Days grew longer in a way I could feel in my bones before my eyes believed. The snow retreated to the stubborn places, the roof hummed at a higher pitch. The stove sulked in the afternoons, as if offended by the competition, and I found my hands free enough to repair the north wall that had wheezed all winter under the wind's interrogation. I sistered a stud to the bowed post and taught the door to seat its latch without needing to be persuaded, and in the evenings I sat on the porch with Scout and the camera and took photographs I could not develop yet, trusting that an image kept in the dark is like a seed kept in the ground, both needing time and chemistry to bloom. When the first green speared up where my string said it should, I laughed loud enough to startle 3 birds and scare 1 rabbit into reconsidering his route. The sprout was indecisive and miraculous, so thin it looked like a thought before it becomes a sentence, and I knelt with a tenderness I would have been embarrassed to show any person and brushed soil gently away from its shoulders, whispering nonsense encouragement that Scout pretended not to hear. More greening followed, a stippled code across the beds that my notebook translated into lists, this row 2 days ahead, that row sulking, this hill aggressive, that patch mysterious. I thinned carrots with a guilt that made me mutter apologies, mulched squash with the straw I had hoarded, staked beans with slender saplings, and discovered that gardening has the same discipline as carpentry. Attention given early reduces pain later, and patience beats improvisation when the season turns stern. The camera earned its place on the table. I took a frame of the first true leaves like hands opening, a frame of Scout asleep between the beds with the solemn trust of someone who believes boundaries will hold, a frame of my own shadow falling long across the rows, and it felt like I was building a second garden on film, one that would feed memory in winter when green is a rumor. The act of framing taught me to see progress that my hunger for outcome might have skipped. I also learned humility under a different teacher. A vole carved a tunnel through half my potato plot as if I had laid out a welcome mat, and 2 tomato seedlings sulked until I admitted the elevation, and the cold nights meant this might not be their mountain, not this year. By the 5th dawn of green, my mind began to permit luxury. If there is enough, perhaps I can trade. Henry's mention of a trading post 7 miles down the fire road returned like a sparrow to its ledge, and I pictured a counter, a ledger, goods laid out with price and pride, and the thought made a bright ache under my ribs. Not for people, not yet, but for the exchange itself. Proof that what my hands made could be measured in salt and matches and needles without anyone asking for a name I did not want to share. I began carving in the evenings again, a cup with pine cones in relief, a small knife with a hilt that fit a child's hand, a frame for a photograph I had not yet developed, and the pile of trade grew enough that I wrapped it in cloth and stowed it in the corner where I kept intentions. On a morning that smelled like wet iron and decision, I pulled the red box from under the bench to oil the saw before a summer's work and found, pushed deep behind it, a folded tourist brochure I had used for my first map with a penciled mark I did not remember making, a small square at the river bend labeled in my own careful hand, Masons, and below it a note I must have written in winter and somehow forgotten. Salt, matches, coffee. Questions! I looked at Scout, and he looked at me as if to say, the garden can spare you for a day, and I answered the note I had left myself. Tomorrow we go. The first time I left the mountain by intention and not escape, I carried my work in a wrapped bundle like a small, breakable truth, And when the trading post's tin bell coughed over my head and 3 men turned as one to examine the rumor of me, I realized the hardest part of disappearing is deciding when to be seen. The fire road unspooled like an old scar along the ridge, each bend teaching my feet a language they had not needed at home, the cadence of downslope caution, the sideways slide that keeps your knees and pride intact, the pause at gullies where storm water chews the intellect out of rock. Scout trotted ahead with a confidence I borrowed the way you borrow a coat in weather you have underestimated, circling back to check me at intervals that told me he knew where we were, even when I did not. I had rehearsed my speech in the garden while thinning carrots, a handful of sentences that would buy necessities without buying trouble. Trade, not plead. Pay, not owe. Answer what is asked. Invent nothing. And by the time the rusted roof of Mason's came into view beyond the last stand of poplar, the words in my mouth felt polished by fear into smooth stones. Inside, the place smelled of oil and mice and coffee you could chew, shelves shouldering a logic I could respect. Hooks by hooks, cans with cans, cordage stacked by thickness like winter by severity. A potbelly stove in the corner made a circle of men who talked in the low register of people who have earned their breath. Their conversation hitched and resumed when the bell declared me. The man behind the counter had a face like split oak and eyes that did not waste motion. "Help you, boy?" he said, and the sentence contained questions and mercy in equal parts. I laid the bundle on the wood as if it were my second heart, unwrapped each piece with the gravity of a promise. The maple cup carved with pine cones, the rabbit fur mittens stitched tight against cold, the toy knife whose blade was only wood, but whose grip insisted on being held. And then I arranged my needs to one side with the same neatness. A paper of needles, a canister of salt, a box of matches, a small bottle of kerosene that caught light even in shade. He picked up the cup and rolled it in his hands the way a man checks the heft of a new tool. "You make these?" he said, and I nodded, because if I was going to declare anything in this room, it had better be the truth. He set the cup down like a verdict that favored me but would not ruin my character. "Good work, not enough for all that." He let the statement sit while the stove popped. "But I can make it be if you bring me more. Tourists eat craft like candy when the leaves go loud. You up on Eagle Ridge?" The question flicked a match in my gut. I kept my face still and my sentences within the fence I had built. "I'm up high," I said, which revealed nothing and refused insult. He cut his eyes toward the men by the stove, then back to me with a look that understood both the burden and the use of a secret. "Mountain folk mind their own," he said, which was not a promise and not a threat, only a law, and then he rung me up with a pencil and a pad like an oath taken in graphite. He gave advice as change. "Salt keeps more than meat. It keeps mistakes from getting expensive. Matches are for when pride fails. Don't burn pine overnight unless you like cleaning flues." He slid a paper sack toward me that felt heavier than its contents. "Name's Mason, if you hadn't guessed. If you're smart enough to come down here once, you're smart enough to come again before January teaches you new arithmetic." The men by the stove acknowledged me with a quarter-inch nod that felt like being stamped by a country I was only visiting. Scout accepted a scrap of jerky from a hand that did not ask for permission, tail subdued in deference to his handler's nerves, and also in gratitude that had difficulty being moderate. I left with the sack riding high and my bundle riding low and a ledger running in my head. Stock renewed, risk accepted, map redrawn. The road home rose with a patience that had no interest in my haste, and the bundle at my hip thumped a rhythm that steadied me more than the coffee would have. At a bend where the view opened, the ridge showed itself in a long exhale, our roof seam a dark line like a stitched wound that was healing, the garden a new geometry the sun had found time to admire. I stopped and let the truth of it wash me clean. I had entered the lowland, navigated commerce without becoming merchandise, and returned with what a winter respects. Back in the cabin, I arrayed the purchases on the table the way a soldier lays out his kit, checked the wick of the lamp, portioned the matches into 2 tins so that a future slip would not erase the whole lesson, tucked the salt away from the damp like a letter one does not want the weather to find, then sat with Scout while the day tipped and the shadows from the rafters arranged themselves into a script I could nearly read. The camera on the mantel watched me without speaking, and I promised it a photograph, my hand on the knob of a boy congratulating me on its long memory for In the night, I woke to the soft percussion of snow melting the roof and threaded through familiar sounds. Not fast, not official, things running because they must. I lay still and felt the world like a large animal rolling over, and by morning, 2 new tracks would dent the mud by the trading post, calling to a curiosity I had only just learned to permit. Strength deserts you without a farewell, and the day the cedar branch cracked under my ambition and dropped me 15 feet onto ground that had done me no harm, I learned how quickly a life can be measured in what you cannot reach and who will fetch it for you. It was weather for generosity, a blue that made decisions seem easy, and I climbed higher than caution would have counseled because the fragrant boughs promised a mattress that did not remember other people's sleep. The trunk had the rot that pretends solidity until weight asks its opinion, and my saw barely finished the cut before the world argued me toward the ground. The sound my leg made was not a break so much as a decision I had not been consulted about, and the breath left me in a fair imitation of cowardice before courage remembered my address. The crawl home tasted of iron and pine sap, a mixture I could not reverse, and Scout alternated between pressing against my shoulder to keep me from sinking into the self-pity that lay down at every root and ranging ahead to confirm the trail had not moved while my attention was elsewhere. Inside, the cabin changed from sanctuary to problem set. Water too far, firewood too scattered, food near and useless without flame. Pride had opinions, but they did not shiver, so I made a crutch from a forked limb padded with rags that remembered summer shirts, dragged the water bucket by inches across the floor with the wrong hand, while the right hand held my ribs still enough not to argue, and coaxed the stove with small splits until it conceded heat like an old creditor parting with a coin. Pain erased hours, then sharpened them. Morning and night were merely the times when I counted my losses and my inventory with different lighting. Scout knocked at the door in the rhythm we had long ago agreed meant, I am carrying something that needs your hands. And when I called him in, he placed a rabbit by my boot with a pride that could have powered a small town, then stepped back to watch me remember how to thank a partner without sounding like a sermon. I dressed the meat on a cutting board, set across my lap. Not because the act required a chair, but because I needed to feel like a person who sat for a reason other than defeat. The smell of iron rose off my hands, and the stove answered with a contentment I needed to borrow. The dog's intelligence expanded to fill the shape of my absence from normal life. He learned which shelf held the wrapped bread heel and nosed it down to where I could reach, which rope lowered the tin mug from the beam where I had hung groceries out of mouse reach, which look moved me faster than medicine when I sat too still and let the dark nibble at my resolve. I made a pulley out of stubbornness and cord, a lowering rig that brought the kettle close without tearing stitches I did not possess. And in the long afternoons, I taught myself to take aim from a chair, to set snares from memory, to keep the ledger with a precision that would have pleased a banker, wood in, heat out, water in, steam out, pain in, patience out. The crutch bruised my underarm until it felt like a lesson, changing shape into a scar, and when the first day arrived that my foot accepted my weight without filing a complaint, I cried noiselessly and without shame because relief and gratitude often choose the same doorway and there is no sense making them wait in the yard. Recovery taught me thrift more than hunger ever did. I inventoried everything with suspicion and grace. Movement, light, minutes, the dog's stamina, my voice when it rose loud enough to scare a winter thought away. I learned to say, not today, to projects that would have proven something to no one, and yes now to small repairs that would save my future self from cursing my name. When I could limp to the porch, I built an observation post wedged into 3 pines with boards I had meant for something more glamorous, and up there I found a stillness that did not condemn me for not striding. The morning I first climbed those steps without the crutch, I lay on the platform and listened to the valley, write its little letter of noises, a water conversation, a jay considering an outrage, the long absence between breezes that sometimes means weather is sneaking up in socks. Then Scout's body took on that carved listening I trust more than instruments. He pointed his nose down valley, ears forward, tail a level line, and through the glass of my old binoculars I saw movement in uniforms the color of tree bark. Men aligned with a grid that had nothing to do with crops. The badge flashes were not law with teeth, but law with maps. Forestry, search, and rescue. moving with that patient accuracy that finds what it looks for eventually if it wants to. We fell into the plan I had rehearsed in the useless hours when the leg would not sleep. Photographs into the floor safe I had disguised as loose planks, camera and journal into the hollow by the hearth. Personal things dismantled until they looked like a hunter passing through, trade goods tucked behind the false back of the cupboard where once the lamp had slept. The aim was not to deny habitation, only to deny duration so that a glance would see a night and not a year. I taught the dog the hand signal for silence the way you teach a child to cross a road, repetition and consequence. By dusk, the searchline had camped 2 ridges off, their fire a polite glow that meant no danger and also meant the world was nearer than I liked. I lay on my platform and watched embers ascend like small lanterns, and when I finally slept, it was to a dream of smoke that did not belong to their camp, a smoke thicker and dirtier and flavored with resin. And at dawn, the horizon confirmed what my sleep had warned. The west wore a column of fire-colored cloud, and the mountain had come to collect on every promise I had ever made about readiness. Wildfire does not argue, it announces. And when the west ridge lifted a wall of heat that made the sky speak in a voice older than law, I understood that everything I had built, roof stitches, stove rituals, garden plans, would be graded in a single exam that did not allow retakes. The first lesson was perimeter. I tore the woodpile's neat rhetoric into 2 messier stacks and dragged them far from the eaves, where beauty had previously persuaded me to forget physics. The shovel bit into the brittleness of a thirsty yard, sketching a ring of mineral soil that would refuse to carry flame the way a stubborn mind will sometimes refuse a lie. I limbed the lower branches of the closer pines until they looked like soldiers, with belts hitched high, denying the fire a ladder to the crown. Gutters became cisterns and then became language, funneling water into barrels until the planks under my feet turned dark with the comfort of surplus. The tarp seam got a last inspection, the roof a last drenching, the doorways a wet curtain that would sadden sparks. Scout absorbed my nervous energy and returned it as choreography. He fetched the soaked burlap sacks to their stations as if they were sheep and he, their quiet shepherd. He learned the difference between ember and ash by the way my foot moved, trotting toward whatever my body had noticed before my mind had, dropping the sack with a precision that made me consider awarding him rank. The sky went from copper to bruise, and the fire's sound became a presence in the chest, not roar exactly, more like a continuous tearing. I spoke to the cabin mindlessly and earnestly. Hold, 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 the way you plead with a friend who has decided to quit the road too early. The first embers fell like tiny declarations of war, and the ring of dirt refused them with a casual authority that emboldened me. But fire does not concede so easily. It sent larger scouts that lodged in the moss along the north sill and in the fluff of the straw near the porch, and in the optimism of my garden mulch. And we stamped and smothered and swore, and my hands blistered into a sermon about preparedness. Night drew its circle tighter, and the front itself arrived. Not as a wall, but as a series of questions the house answered one at a time, a falling limb, the size of a judgment landing on the roof to test the angle of the tarp, a latch of heat sneaking under the door to test whether wet cloth can hold its breath long enough to matter, a run of sparks like spilled stars settling along the drip edge to test whether tin deserves its reputation. The air became a syrup you had to push to move through. My lungs kept a ledger, in and out, debt and payment, and when my knees trembled, I pretended it was only the resonance of the ground. There is a moment every long fight offers when you are allowed to imagine losing without being required to accept it. Mine came near dawn when the wind shifted 2 degrees, and the roar moved northward with its appetite intact, but pointed elsewhere, the house relaxing the smallest fraction, as if someone had untied a knot at the base of the spine. The ring held, the roof smiled a tired smile, the barrels were low but not empty. The dog lay down for the first time and flicked one ear with the luxury of boredom. The garden had a black eye and a busted lip, but half of it still breathed. The smokehouse was singed at the corners, like a letter held too long to a candle, but had not confessed to flame. When the light returned for good, it found a clearing that looked like a green island in a new sea of charcoal. I sat on the porch step and let my hands shake as if they belonged to another person. Scout put his head on my knee in the posture of an old friend who understands victory can make you cry louder than grief. We worked triage with the tired competence of people who have passed through panic into policy. Soak the sill again, rake out the gutter mouths, shift the barrels to the side that had been most tested, check the attic for embers that would pretend to be dead until noon, step inside and drink water like it was an idea you had doubted and now accepted. The mountain does not give you time for ceremony when it has other lessons queued. By afternoon, the fire was a bruise on the horizon, and the air had thinned enough to allow sentences. My sentences turned toward a different work, the kind that requires papers and rooms with flags. The searchline had moved through without finding what it wanted. The fire had reminded me that survival is not the same as safety, and the ledger I kept under the mantel suddenly contained columns it had not needed before. Legitimacy, ownership, permission to exist without hiding. I pulled from the mantel the camera Henry had given me and took one frame of the house that had chosen to live and one of the ring of dirt that had made refusal into architecture. And in the dark scrape of the shutter, I heard a future voice reading my present life aloud to a person who needed to believe in repair. I spread the deeds I did not possess in my mind and felt how light the table was without their weight. The county seat lay 30 miles like 300, but course and cost are questions that can be answered with legs and time if the will is louder than the ache. When I lay down that night, I placed the map on my chest, the way a soldier might lay a medal where he could feel it rise and fall. And before the stove folded me into sleep, I made the decision that would pull me into rooms with carpet and clocks. I would go to town, not to disappear inside it, but to step into it carrying my name like a tool I had finally sharpened. In the morning, I would pack the portfolio I had not yet assembled and begin teaching myself the language of law. The morning I began to build a case for my own adulthood, the mountain looked at me with the same silence it uses for weather and trespassers, and I understood that courage is not an emotion but a schedule you keep when your hands would rather be splitting wood. I inventoried proof the way I had inventoried kindling, not for drama, but for burn time. Income needed records, so I asked Mason to begin writing my trades into a ledger that did not blush at small numbers. He raised an eyebrow that contained both praise and pity and began the column with a neat hand that looked like it had signed more important things. I turned my own notebooks into account books, listing out go with the kind of honesty that undermines vanity: salt, kerosene, needles, coffee when I could afford to insult my thrift, and my pencil carved out a picture of solvency that would not impress a banker, but might persuade a judge who has seen too much to be impressed. Education required pages to be filled with effort rather than speculation, so I traded for textbooks that smelled of chalk and patience. Algebra by the light of a kerosene lamp felt like fishing at night. You cast into darkness and learn the river by the pull. And when the equations began to balance under my hand, the small joy of a right answer lifted me the way a trout lifts a line. Government came next, a book that explained the machinery I intended to step into without getting crushed. I learned words that had never come up at the stove: jurisdiction, affidavit, emancipation, and I copied definitions as if they were recipes. Residence was the easy part and the hard part. The cabin held us in a way that made proof feel redundant, but paper wants witness, so I photographed the garden every 2 weeks from the same angle until growth itself became a statement, dated the images at the library in town when I made my careful trips, and asked 2 scattered neighbors, the trapper with the old hound and Cal 2 ridges east, to write what they had seen without telling what I had not told. Their letters were spare and kind in the way mountain kindness often is. When I finally took the bus into the county seat and the courthouse steps rose in long gray lines like education made vertical, my knees informed me they had not been consulted. I put 1 foot on stone and told the boy who had once waited at a gas station to carry the portfolio like a shield, because the difference between running away and walking in is whether your hands are empty. The clerk behind the glass did not look like a monster or a savior, which helped. I asked for forms in a voice that had learned not to whisper, and when she slid them through the slot, I did not let my hands shake until I had turned away. The questions were both easy and cruel, name and date and history clarified into blanks that did not accept essays. I wrote my name as if carving it into a beam, copied my birth date from memory that had taught itself not to flinch, and for custody and support, I wrote self in letters that admitted vulnerability without asking for pity. Emancipation had requirements that were designed to discourage myth, but myth had already been burned out of me by weather and sawdust. I attached ledgers, photographs, letters, and a paragraph that did not describe a mother or a gas station, only a stove and a roof and a dog and a calendar of work. Waiting for the hearing became its own labor. I split wood and parsed statutes in alternation, built a small cabinet that I traded for a pair of boots that could stand line and ceremony, and taught Scout how to wait, tied to the bumper of a truck without worrying the rope with teeth, because some rooms will not admit a companion even if he has rescued you more times than medicine. When the day came, the mountain seemed to shorten under my boots, as if the path to town had decided to lean toward me. Social services sent a woman who walked my clearing with care and asked questions that had the courtesy not to be cruel even when the answers were. She touched the stove with 2 fingers, like a person testing a myth for warmth, admired the rain catch as if it were a fountain in a more official yard, listened without trying to fill the silences with a story that would make me easier to file, and when she left, she squeezed my shoulder, once the way women sometimes do when they recognize a child they cannot set down anywhere safe, but admire for not breaking. The home inspection letter that arrived a week later used words I wanted to pin above the door. Sustained, competent, safe enough. The hearing date stamped itself across my days like a watermark you cannot wash out. I oiled the saw, not because the judge would care, but because care is contagious, laid out clothes that had no holes and little vanity, clipped my hair with a patience that left my ears unconvinced, and tacked into the portfolio the last thing I had decided to include. A photograph of Scout with his head on the bed, the wood stove cutting a steady square of light onto the floor, proof of companionship that no statute recognizes and every human understands. On the morning of the hearing, I parked the truck Mason had helped me find under a cottonwood whose branches muttered advice, tightened the twine around the portfolio until it looked like I meant every page, and walked the courthouse hall, lined with portraits of men who had never split my wood. When the bailiff called my name, the syllables sounded both smaller and truer than they ever had, and I stepped into a room where a gavel rested like a stone, ready to decide whether a boy could own his own winter. The bench did not care about my roof seam, or my ring of dirt, or the way the stove had taught me to keep a night alive. And in the clean light of that room, with flags and clocks, I felt as naked as a sapling in a logging yard. But when the judge asked me to speak for myself, it turned out my voice had been building its case for years without telling me. I stood straight because slouching is a confession, said my name in a tone that admitted both history and present tense, and described not a tragedy but a ledger. Income regular enough to be boring, expenses disciplined enough to impress a grandmother, education pursued with a stubbornness that had nothing to do with grades and everything to do with being hard to patronize. The county attorney asked questions that were shaped like traps but were actually bridges if you walked them with steadiness. Who feeds you? Who shelters you? Who calls when trouble comes? And I answered with verbs and not excuses. I cook, I repair, I learn, I trade, I have taught a roof to forget a hole. Mason spoke for me with the clean economy he uses to price screws. He did not embellish or baptize, he testified. Boy trades fair, boy returns debt before expiration, boy refuses charity until it becomes a partnership. Cal described the wind smoke rise steady from my when other chimneys in our scatter of a community gasped and then fell silent. The social worker used the phrase I had only not at risk and coughed and moves a hat and chirped at me without the inches and said, "You understand that emancipation is not permission to quit needing. It is the court acknowledging own first responder, and for a second, to the exact kind I had been practicing. He signed, and the word, it tasted like iron and paper and the memory of a long night defended with water and will. The clerk stamped the decree with a violence that startled me, and then smiled as if to apologize for the sound, slid the copy across the counter so carefully you would have thought it was a new, and I held it in both hands as if letters could sag. The second errand came easier. Property records had to be suspicious, since men used them, but the cabin had been abandoned, not only in a practical sense. On paper, too, it had slipped out of someone's ledger and into the county's adverse possession, the clerk said, which sounded like an under the glass toward with my long name for this exact role. I felt my spine stack itself in alignment. Outside, the sky had the flat blue of a day that has decided to be. I sat in the truck and read the document aloud. Hours, I said to the wood and to the mountain I could. Hours, to the stove and the ring of dirt and the garden that had been a rumor when snow covered everything, and Scout thumped approval into the seat with a patience that contained both welcome and a dare to live up to the paper. The drive home felt shorter than it had any right to, a kind of elastic in the road that snapped me back to the clearing with a clean release. I hung the decree where I would not forget it and would not worship it, next to the camera and the tin box and the carved dog, and the first photograph I had managed to develop of beans climbing their string toward a story. In the evening, I wrote a new ledger page, headed not with numbers, but with verbs that now carried weight. Build, teach, invite, because ownership without purpose is just a fatter kind of hiding. That purpose arrived faster than I had planned. The fire had burned a ragged honesty into our valley, and in the weeks that followed, I found injured things at my doorstep, as if the mountain had begun forwarding its mail. An owl with one eye like a coin, a colt thin as a rumor, a boy from down valley with a silence that matched my own from another life. I could not save all of them, but I could make a place where saving could be attempted with dignity. The bunkhouse design grew on the back of envelopes and old grocery sacks, and then grew in lumber on the far side of the garden. The sign I carved for the road said only Mountainside Sanctuary, because naming is a promise, and I did not need to explain it to those who were meant to find it. The first group came in a van that sounded like a cough. They unfolded themselves from the seats with that careful belligerence teenagers use when mercy has disappointed them, and I greeted them with the same respect I would offer to fire, not fear, not flattery, but the acknowledgement that a force has entered your yard and you will either shape it or be shaped by it. Welcome, I said, which contains risk for both speaker and hearer, and I showed them the workbench and the garden beds and the bunk rails built to bear weight without squeak. And at the fire that night, we did not talk about mothers or absence. We talked about joints and glue and how a square tells the truth quietly. Weeks later, with the program sputtering into steadiness and the deed no longer feeling like a costume, an envelope arrived with the county seal as neat and final as a stitch. Inside was a court summons for a hearing I had not requested, a review of status, set for a date that made my stomach lift and settle like a canoe in a wake. And as I stood on the porch with the paper in my hand and the mountain leaning in to hear my decision, I realized that every chapter I had claimed would be tested in a room again. When I pushed the door open and called Scout, the gavel in my memory lifted, and somewhere in town a judge reached for his spectacles.